Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third night of Virtual Evenings for Educators Conversing in Clay. My name is Laura Schilling, and I'm the Content Specialist for Teacher Programs here at LACMA. It's great to see folks putting their land acknowledgements in the chat. I hope you continue doing so. If you would like to access captions throughout the program, please click Show Captions on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. My colleague, Jose Gonzalez, is providing tech support today, so if you have any issues accessing the captions or any tech-related questions, please send him a private message. Next slide. Next slide. LACMA recognizes that we occupy land in Los Angeles County, originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Kizh, Serrano, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of the lands and waters in Los Angeles County. Next slide. So we'll take a quick look at the remaining schedule for this program. We're already halfway through. Tonight is our special talk with curator Rosie Mills and artist Courtney M. Leonard. There will be a Q&A portion at the end, so feel free to type your questions in the chat throughout the program, and we will keep track of them for you. There will also be opportunities for you to unmute yourselves at the end of the program and ask your questions today. And on Thursday, we have a workshop inspired by Leonard's work for grades 4 through 8 with teaching artist Katie Lipsett. In this workshop, you will explore the idea of abundance, both its presence and absence, through the process of making and decorating baskets out of paper. And the link is in the chat to sign up for each event. Putting that in the chat now. And we'll go to the next slide. Once again, I probably sound like a broken record, but once again, I want to share our curricular resources with you. We create these for every Evenings for Educators program. They include images, information, lesson plans, including the lesson plans from the workshops you attend. So definitely check those out. Those are in the chat now as well. And if you're participating for LAUSD salary point credit or any other kind of professional development credit, be sure to fill out the survey that will be shared in the chat at the end of tonight's program. If you have any questions about the different credit options, you can contact me via private message. And before I introduce our speakers, I want to give a brief rundown of the program because we have a number of different components tonight. We will first hear from curator Rosie Mills about conversing in clay and Courtney Leonard's work within that context. After that, we will watch a video about Leonard's work that was created by LACMA, and then we'll hear her speak about her practice before entering into discussion with Rosie. And finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A with you, our audience. So I'd now like to introduce tonight's speakers, Courtney M. Leonard and Rosie Mills. Courtney M. Leonard is a Shinnecock artist and filmmaker who has contributed to the offshore movement. Leonard's current work embodies the multiple definitions of breach, an exploration and documentation of historical ties to water, whale, and material sustainability. In collaboration with national and international museums, cultural institutions, and Indigenous communities in North America, New Zealand, Nova Scotia, and the United States embassies, Leonard's practice investigates narratives of cultural viability as a reflection of environmental record. And responsible for medieval to mid-19th century works, Dr. Rosie Mills joined the Decorative Arts and Design Department in 2013. She is currently curating Eternal Medium, Seeing the World in Stone, which examines the aesthetics of the rich but little-known medium of hard stones. She is also co-curator with Stacy Steinberger of Conversing in Clay, Ceramics from the LACMA Collection, an exhibition that illuminates LACMA's permanent collection by comparing contemporary ceramic acquisitions with earlier examples from across the museum. Welcome, Courtney and Rosie. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Laura, and hello, everyone. Sorry, I think I froze there. Hello, everyone. And for my visual description, I'm a white woman with wavy blonde hair, wearing a grey sweater and a red beaded necklace. Could we have the next slide, please? I first met Courtney M. Leonard during the planning of Conversing in Clay, Ceramics from the LACMA collection. LACMA had already acquired her work, and my co-curator, Stacy Steinberger, and I wanted to discuss including one of the pieces in the exhibition. The concept of the show, which opened here at LACMA in August and runs through May 21st, is to mutually illuminate contemporary and historical works in the museum's permanent collection by bringing them into visual dialogue with one another. Stacey and I assembled 14 displays that juxtapose works by 15 international contemporary artists with selections of historical works from around the world to examine how artists working today relate to international artistic traditions of the medium, both through deliberate references to the past and by engaging with aspects of clay's materiality that have inspired makers over the centuries. Next slide, please. I want to underline that these juxtapositions were created by me and Stacey as a way to interrogate our collection and foster new conversations through comparing and contrasting the works. So while some artists are clearly producing work inspired by specific traditions in ceramics, other displays were not anticipated by the artist. And in those instances, we wanted to make sure we discussed these in advance to make sure they made sense and didn't have any unintended implications. So that was the situation with Courtney. Next slide, please. Since the exhibition relies upon visual similarities, we wanted to juxtapose Courtney's 2016 piece, Abundance Red Algae, with a historical example that shares a similar open work form. Together with our lighting designer, we were able to achieve these beautiful shadows in the exhibition that serve to highlight this point of comparison. Next slide, please. The basket on the left is a tableware design created by the British ceramics factory Wedgwood. It usually sits on a stand to catch drips from the candied fruit preserved in syrup that it was made to contain, but we excluded the stand from the display in order to achieve the shadows and focus on the form here. Courtney's substitution of brittle earthenware for the flexible fiber of fish baskets and fishing nets that inspired her form, coupled with her iconic title about abundance, not iconic, ironic title about abundance, draws attention to the political and environmental challenges her community faces in sustaining their fragile coastal ecosystem. Courtney's work inspired us to reinterpret the Wedgwood basket in terms of power structures and relationships to food sources. Wedgwood's design also substitutes earthenware for the fiber materials of its model, but it does so to present a romanticized view of a class system in which rural communities who produce such basketry crafts also cultivated the produce on wealthy tables. As part of the show, we worked with Courtney to create a short film that's on view in the gallery and is also accessible from the exhibition page on LACMA's website. So now we'd like to play that video for you. So I think that's all queued up so we can watch it. Are we supposed to hear the audio on this or just the subtitles?
A community's history and connection to clay. I'm a mixed media artist, primarily focused in ceramics and installation work that pertains to our community's issues as coastal people. I'm from the Shinnecock Nation, which is on the east end of Long Island. And some of the issues that we're facing have a relationship to climate change, rising waters, warming temperatures, access to food and sovereignty. And 2014 is when I began the work of Breach, but Breach is a layered translation of my life and relationship as a Shinnecock person. And when you're Shinnecock, you're people of the level land. That's our translation for Shinnecock, people of the level land, people of the shore. So the question that I pursue in Breach is, how can a culture sustain itself when it no longer has access to the environment that fashions that culture? When I first began the work that is called Abundance, and that is the basket form that's woven with earthenware clay, it was looking at a particular time over the past 5 years where we've had supermoons. There's been a different lunar understanding that maybe other cultures are not as observant in regards to how our moon cycles work. And the levees that were set up by the town areas were not following a moon cycle. They weren't following a lunar cycle. And so they automatically closed. The combination of that occurring led to a lack of oxygen in the water and a mass fish die. There were all of these dead, rotting fish that were eventually coming onto our shoreline. And we didn't have a lot of economic funding to be able to deal with that abundance of fish. You can imagine the physicality of the process of death being one that lends to magnitude of a certain unpleasant smell. It was something that really sat in the memories of the community. It's also about when spring comes and the waters start to warm. Long Island has a huge population of people that are living on the island, some of which do not have city septic systems set up. And if you're on an island that's at sea level, then the water has no way to filtrate in a proper span of time before it goes into our bays. So that leads to what's referred to as nitrogen runoff, and it forms red algae blooms and toxic blooms that then also cause fish to die. To have an abundance of something means to have plenty. It means to have access. It also means that if you had a fish basket that actually functioned versus the one that I'm offering, you could fill your basket with fish, but you can't fill your basket with fish if they're not healthy, if they could harm you. And so there's a lack of an abundance in the positioning that I'm using with ceramics as a material. And it's akin to how our environment is unable to hold the fragility and the impact that it's faced through man-made systems and infrastructure. So when I look back to places that I grew up in and homes that I visited in New England, there was always this wall where people would hang their baskets after using it for bread or sifting. But then I would have days where I would look at fish nets and see the expansion of them and realize that when you're thinking about what a bloom is, it's not a flower per se, it's just an expansion of algae. So the word is kind of interesting, this idea of blooming. And that's when I began to not weave the rim closed, but open it up. And so there are some variants within abundance where there is no rim and it looks like a bloom or a blossom, or it just opens up as a net form, but still nestles as a basket. Depending on how you connect the coils, you are almost kind of creating this bridge system. So there's a lot of indigenous knowledge in weaving about strength that some people are apprehensive to the material of the clay coils as being fragile. But why not? Why haven't we grown up with enough understanding of care as a society that we need to have something concrete and we're not knowing actually how to hold our hands and how to hold them gently or with more pressure or with ease? There are some similarities to weaving, but I definitely do not call myself a weaver. I know a lot of indigenous weaving elders and younger generation of weavers, and it takes a long time to harvest the materials for weaving. That also relates to water issues as well. So LACMA is in Tongva territory. There's a lot of basket makers throughout California, and they are also activists and amplifying the issues of water and drought, and also land ownership, where they're not able to access or harvest some of the material for their basket making. And there are a lot of people that use clay as a material to counter environmental issues. But unless you're getting the clay yourself, you don't actually know where that's coming from, how it's mined, and what the impact of that mining industry is. And ceramic people are at the very low level of that impact in industry, but we are a part of it. We're a part of that system. So I'm hoping that we'll continue to build collective labor and responsibility, and maybe we'll get to a point where we won't have to put so much labor into fixing things because we've been more mindful about how we should live and honor the place that we're blessed to be in and all that it offers to us. I do think that I've learned through the humbleness that clay offers, because sometimes things do not translate and survive firings or movement or impact. And that's what keeps me humble and keeps me mindful and keeps me going with clay, because it's not easy, like at times, and it always brings new challenges. I often feel like that's also the human part of clay, is you're in a relationship. You'll have your arguments, but you'll have your days of complete joy and understanding. And so there's this kind of back and forth of knowing with the material.
It is such a pleasure to have Courtney here with us tonight. We really enjoyed making this film with you, Courtney, and I know you've brought some slides for us today. I wonder if you could take us through them and talk a bit about the development of the Breach project, of which, of course, the work shown in the LACMA exhibition is a part. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And yeah, just thank you for all of the support in creating the video. It was a blessing in terms of being able to expand, in particular on the Abundance series, which is a part of a larger ongoing life project and journey that I call Breach. Breach is an entry point into the history of my community's relationship as water people and people who were hired onto some of the Yankee tall ships during the late 1800s, early 1900s, until it was banned off the coast of Long Island. And I came into the word breach because breach is kind of that whale physically breaching. It's a breach of contract or an imposition. And then every year I'm doing these different logbooks. And so if you can go to the first slide that shows the map of Long Island. I wanted to bring a few of you all that are joining us this evening. Thank you for being here. Kind of to an aerial view, a map of Long Island and my home, and to center us in terms of land to where my community is on the east end of Long Island, and also offer the relationship of the shape of Long Island to the word breach as well. And being that in our community, we view Long Island as a whale in terms of its shape, and the word breach as being that whale when it rises through the surface line and the sight line of the ocean. And on the South Fork, so where the tail of the whale is toward the east, is Shinnecock Nation, our territory. And then the further east, you get to Montauk Point and Montaukett people. And then mid-island is Unkachog and Poospatuck community. So those are a few of the current somewhat land territories between either unrecognized nations, recognized nations through the state and colony of New York, and then federally recognized communities such as Shinnecock that received federal recognition in 2010 through President Obama's administration. To the left, the images are kind of showing you what I view sometimes when I'm home. I'm not currently living on Long Island. I live in Minnesota, so I'm in Dakota Territory, and I'm in southern Minnesota in a town called Northfield. And I talk a lot with my friends and family members about what it is that we see and observe around us. So the images on the left-hand side are things that I would witness over my lifetime living on Long Island, some of which were hurricanes. And the top left image is an image of Hurricane Sandy. And the bottom right image, or left image, is an image of concrete rebar structures to act as a calcium attraction for coral reef growing. When I view these images of what's happening around me, and then how science and humanity is trying to respond to it, I actually see a traditional home from our territory. They would be made out of thatched houses. And I think about our homes kind of being underwater in these moments. And I don't know if you can see the relationship between the weaving of abundance and this type of structure form, but I tend to have these layered correlations in terms of what I see in my environment and how I translate that into my work. So observation is a key part of my learning process and journey as an artist, and also what I try to offer an audience. And I also think that questions are important as an artist and someone who's learning in my life. If I follow a question, I don't always have to have a concrete answer, but I can explore what that question offers. And with Breach, I started this question that was, can a culture sustain itself when it no longer has access to the material that fashions that culture? And I think I came into that word for a lot of different reasons, but it really reflected upon the environmental issues we were facing when those hurricanes came in, and when our waters were rising, and when we're dealing with coastal erosion, or the series of abundance that led into my making of the fish baskets, or my reference to those through what I was witnessing with those mass fish dyes that was described in the video. If you go to the next slide. At this point, I just want to connect some of the other works that are part of Breach. So one of the earliest pieces that I created when Breach started, this idea of using a word that had these different layers of entry points, was looking back to a whale strike. It was a finback whale that was hit by a shipping boat, and its carcass and remains had washed ashore close to my nation's territory. And when I was thinking back to that time and events that were happening in about 2014, when different countries were talking about getting rid of their ivory to combat the elephant ivory industry. And one of the stances that they were taking at the time that kind of relates to what's happening today was to make a visual act where they brought all of the ivory into a plaza and crushed it as a counter to this ivory concern and the endangered species issues that people were concerned about and related to elephants and ivory. But what happened with ivory laws is it kind of lumped all ivory into that. And so it affected indigenous communities that were and still are just practicing their traditional subsistence harvesting rights and ability to use material. And so my translation was creating this palette of sperm whale teeth that I called Breach number 2. And I have about, my goal is about 13 of these palettes would be created. I currently have 6 that are created, and they're to represent eventually this idea of these palettes coming together and each representing a whale that would be a part of a whale clan family system. They're all individually made out of clay, which is a material I have access to. I think I mentioned that in the abundance video. But that part of materiality relates to that question of, can a culture sustain itself in terms of accessibility? And I have that access to clay. If you go to the next slide, I was also offering this image in terms of visualization and actually seeing a mass fish die, it's a larger scale of understanding that people, when they bear witness, will respond to. But sometimes, you know, this activity of what's happening with our water quality is a daily act and we don't see it. And then I translated that into one of the abundance baskets, become many baskets that are installed here. Next slide. Sometimes when I look at a work, I wonder if it's done in the conversation I presented it in. And in particular, that question is in relationship to breach number 2. It's 48 teeth, or the lower jaw of a sperm whale, but I don't know if everybody can see the full count. So in one iteration, I did another piece called a count, where I took the teeth about 7 by 7, so 49 teeth, and I laid them out on a bed of sand that spanned about 13 by 13 feet. And it was to talk about how extraction, this industry, is one that pulls sand to create concrete, and then that concrete is used as a material for coastal erosion. And what would that mean if that sand was on a ship that hit a whale? So there was this kind of ebb and flow of relationship and tide that made me create this piece. It also looks to me like our shell dresses on deer hide when you stitch them on. So this was kind of my way of relating to an account and counting that is similar to our clothing and regalia, and counting in that way. And then the structures that are to the right and left, they are an extension of the Artifice series, which is kind of how the Abundance series has different studies, different baskets in that series. I have another series called Artifice that looks at those coastal restoration projects and translates them in different ways. And this particular structure is raw clay on PVC pipe that's installed on site when I create this work. If you can go to the next slide. This image is actually when I had the opportunity to think through breach in Tongva territory, and understanding when I went to California to have this kind of call and response relationship of the log that I created for this invitation at Pomona. I drove from Southern California up to close to Northern California, not too far though. And I was looking at all these truckers that were on the road with bumper stickers at the time that said, if you're upset about the traffic, don't blame a trucker. Ask yourself where you got your couch from. It probably said something shorter than that on the bumper sticker. As you can tell, I'm not a short-winded person, but when I thought about that, the idea of who we blame and the collective responsibility of where our goods come from, and as you're driving on those roads in traffic, blaming a trucker, if you just look to the left where the ocean is, you can see all of our carrier boats, the shipping boats that are coming in, like hundreds of these containers on them. And that is where our goods are coming from. So I was thinking about this. One of the trucks actually had one of these containers and it said the company Intermodal. And I started to think about intermodality and the import and export of goods and how that related to the collection at Pomona that had a lot of shell pieces from trade routes from Southern South America, indigenous communities up to the Tongva territory communities, and Quahilla baskets with shell work in it and different things. One of the baskets they had in the collection was a Pomo basket from Northern territory. And it said the word burden. And I thought that was an odd word. And as you can tell, I like to explore these English words and this imposed language a little bit deeper. And that word burden wouldn't be a word that would be used by most indigenous communities for that particular basket. It's not a burden to carry the food for your community or the wood to keep your house warm. It's just a part of living and being and honoring one another. So I translated it to these kind of eel, fish trap, amplifier shapes. And so they're not direct correlations when I create work, they're just layered translations of what I'm seeing. And that was the Intermodal logbook that was in 2019. Next. This is a little bit more of a recent exhibition. It was up for 2 years during COVID, which I think we should also acknowledge too. I don't think as a society we pause enough, but we've gone through a lot in the past couple of years. And this exhibition I installed March of 2020. And then when I flew back, that's when the flights had shut down. And I had done this extension of Breach, thinking through this word nebulous, this ghost or haze of witnessing traps that are left behind that are strongly affecting the routes of whales and seals that are getting caught in the trap lines. And that led to this large installation of the artifice work interwoven with the abundance series and subsistence series into this installation. So I think that might be my last slide. I just wanted to give you a little bit more introductions to the other series. And then also to acknowledge maybe why I go into installation work and art is to think about my memory of environmental witnessing and how I can translate that into a white box space for an audience that could still wander and pursue themselves and investigate and maybe respond in their own way to that question if they choose to do so.
Thank you, Courtney. It's just so fascinating to hear you unpack these aspects of your work. Could we have the next slide, please? One of the things that I really appreciate about your work is your multi-layered and multivalent titles. For example, Abundance Bred Algae for this piece in the show. From the Abundance series, which is part of logbook 16 of the Breach project, you've developed this really elaborate classification system for your work. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about how you use language to structure your work and draw out multiple meanings. And I'm interested to know where the strategy comes from, because it seems to me that it resonates with maybe museum records and nautical records.
Yeah, it's a little bit of all of those. So I had actually intended to tell my family and go into studying medicine when I was in high school. And it was because I would be at that time a second generation college student. And I thought that going into being a doctor would be wonderful for my family. So in high school, I actually spent all my summers when my mom ran the Indian Center in Philadelphia, going to a program called Minority Access for Research Careers at Temple University. And I did clinical rotations in that medical practice every summer. When I got to my senior year in high school, I had also at the same time for those 4 years been doing my art. I was lucky enough to go to a good school that had a good arts program. And at the time they were cutting a lot of arts programs that had a ceramic studio. And so I was doing clay kind of at an early age, but I didn't know it was a valid pursuit for my family, but it was something that I loved. And so my senior year, I applied to colleges that my family would have appreciated. And I also secretly applied to art colleges. And I ended up getting accepted to a college called the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so I went there. And I still think my family was a little bit worried that I was going to go into the arts. So I said, don't worry, I'm going to take museum studies and I'm going to work in museums, and you don't have to worry about me just being an artist. And I did that as a tactical move. But when I took the museum studies program there, I really loved it. I learned a lot about repatriation and the history of that. I learned a lot about collections and how they've affected Indigenous communities. Learned a lot about Edward Curtis and his photographic documentation. And I think that in a way that I didn't realize at the time, that part of the science, the museum, the pursuit of what I loved and what I was passionate about led me to interweaving
what would be a scientific log accession number, or an accession number when I was doing accession numbers for objects going into collections. And also, as I've been following the question of, can a culture sustain itself, and thinking about the issues my community is facing, and realizing that when people want to talk about Indigenous issues and water, they often don't think about people close to their own territories. They go to potential Indigenous communities that are more well known through Hollywood or the history of America or things of that nature. And so coastal Indigenous communities are often not heard when we're facing these issues. So I started that pursuit as a Shinnecock person, but then I started traveling, and I traveled with the intention that I was going to go to places that my ancestors had traveled to on the tall ships. And I've been doing that in a way that has been a true blessing and an honor. But it seems to be working out, that pursuit. So I've been to Aotearoa, I've been to up to Nova Scotia with Mi'kmaq territory, a few artists there that I've engaged and done exchanges with. I've been to Utqiagvik, which is in the North Slope, and they still have the ability to hunt bowhead whales traditionally and through the International Whaling Commission. And they are active marine ecologists and biologists protecting the bowhead. And when I was there in the fall, I was there for the bowhead whale harvest, and they were bringing the whales in. And because of the IWC laws and the things that they have to, they don't have to really, in this idea of breach and imposition, do anything. We don't have to do anything as Indigenous people, but we comply. And so in their compliance and their stewardship of working collaboratively with the government system and other nature resource organizations, when a whale comes in, a whale gets an accession number. A whale gets a number for the database for when it is harvested. Biological samples are taken of that whale, and then that number exists with that whale for that data. And when I was observing that, I think that the combination of the historical logbook on that tall ship, the museum accession number, the scientific logging, it just all makes sense. And it worked well for me as an artist, because sometimes as an artist, the galleries, the market, they can determine an expectation of what you should create over and over again. And when you're pursuing a question, how do you have creative freedom if the market is determining what your outcome should be? That wasn't my intention going into art and creating this work and doing this response. It was to create work for what it was. And so when I start these words, the words allow me creative freedom to enter into what does abundance mean, to take English that's imposed on our community where we're doing language revitalization programs, and flip the switch and dive a little bit deeper on what English is. Like abundance is, you have many, you have plenty. Breach is an imposition, a layer. So each single word became a part of that accession number, and each accession number for myself with abundance, I can have I think I've maybe made 50 or so abundance baskets. Each of them have a different catalog number in the logbook system, but they're all studies. So they're not finished. They're like a part of a family or a study, an account for those years. I think it's a part of a strategy of just existing as a creative maker too, is to just strategize so that it makes sense to the people that have these expectations of a title and a label and an understanding and how it all fits. But if you can see what I showed with my breach logbooks, I do whatever I want that makes sense to what I'm observing, and I use the materials that relate to that decision making. So I weave between the use of clay to woodworking, to video work, to paintings. And sometimes people don't know how to deal with an artist that just does whatever they want. So it was a part of both. It was a strategy of understanding what I was seeing, and it was a strategy to exist an Indigenous person in contemporary art.
I love that. I mean, that just really helps me understand your work even better. It just gives me another route into thinking about your work and what you've been doing. I think we can probably stop sharing the slides now and continue with the conversation. I wanted to ask you about natural and cultural resources and making connections, which you've already talked a lot about. Your work's so interwoven and interconnected. And we've talked in the past about how most of this is due to your very intentional objectives in the REACH project, but it also includes serendipitous moments too, I think. You've talked about this with some of your slides already, but I was wondering if you could also maybe tell us a bit more about your choice of materials, for example, water, clay, whale ivory, shells, and issues around accessing them, as well as cultural resources in your collaborations with communities and institutions. And just thinking back to one of your slides, am I right in thinking that your whale teeth are actually ceramics and not whale ivory?
They're not ivory, they're made out of clay. So it's a counter to kind of expand on that image of me standing by the finback whale. That was in 2005. And we as a nation didn't receive federal recognition, and the whale was federally protected. So what the town did was they cut up the remains of the whale so that it could decompose, because this was, I think, March and April, and the Hamptons, where that surrounds our reservation, wants to use their beach in a nice, healthy way. So, so they don't want a rotting whale there. So they had buried the whale, not that much in collaboration with our community members. So we didn't have access to the baleen of that specific species whale. There are toothed whales and there are baleen whales. And I looked back to that one whale that was a baleen whale, but I started to relate this idea of access and materiality, specifically also to the correlation to the ivory issues in 2014 and 2015 that I was seeing. And the idea that, like, as an artist, if I, at this point, with the federal recognition that we received in 2010, we are now in new conversations about how our community wants to engage with whales. If we wanted to use whale material legally under US law, we would have to have that accession number with every piece of that particular whale that came in, that we received material from. And we are not allowed to sell the material of the whale if it were to be fashioned into any art pieces. So there's a lot of restrictions on use for a species that historically, culturally, traditionally is something we didn't have other people negotiating what we could and could not do with that material. So my offset to freedom in a lot of ways, I guess, is I know clay. I've been with clay for a long time, and I keep going back to clay. And so I can reach out and translate a form of home or a memory into the way that I understand the material and the outcome that I'm hoping to negotiate with the conversation. But not all of the time can clay do everything. Like it's just kind of, sometimes you have to choose what is what's right for what. And I think about that in terms of being a human, like myself. I get burnt out. I can't do everything. So distribution of material and relationship is important. So when I want to talk further about breach, and I'm seeing what's happening around me, when I'm blessed to witness those things, then I think, does it make sense to play, or does it make sense to use something else? Or does it make sense to actually use the material itself? Like when I did the bed of sand, the choice of using sand as a material for me growing up, like my grandfather would be like, sand's not art. And like, and a palette is often very confusing for a art truck to pick up. And you have to explain, no, this is the palette that goes, like, this is the art. And so sometimes digging a little bit deeper, that material has a valid presence just being itself. And then what happens when you overlay these things that have their own power, then I would say that that might be a few of the examples of like why sometimes people reference me as a material artist or somebody that expands on materiality in that way. I don't know. Those are just sometimes how I choose situations. And the serendipity part, this idea of like, you never know what's going to happen. The going with the flow process, that's kind of how I am. Like I've done artist residencies. Most of the time it's going to a place so I can spend time with it. It's not going to a residency per se, so that I know what work I'm making when I show up. Usually that practice is also very scary, to always start new, like to not know what you're doing. But I think having the confidence that it'll work out as it should be, it does work out. So I think that might lend to the, like, looking at nature, responding, seeing where it takes you, but being humble and being forgiving to yourself if it's not something amazing. Like one time I only had 2 days on this tall ship that I did a residency with through the Charles W. Morgan. And I was like, what am I going to do in 2 days with clay? Why does clay need to be here? Like these are questions that I taught. So I ended up actually remembering when I was little and I used to take a piece of paper out and they would put the pennies underneath and take a crayon on its side and rub the crayon and you get an etching or a mark of the memory of that coin. Well, that particular time I figured I'm going to take a piece of paper out and a crayon and I'm going to rub the deck. And so I physically rubbed the surface of the ship onto paper, and then I could take that paper back with me. And when the answers came later in the studio, I had some sort of record I could work with or play with. So those are just do whatever. Like it's kind of my approach. Yeah, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I think it works for myself. And I often ask my students that I work with, who is your audience? What are you doing? Who are you doing it for? And also know that you don't have to tell everybody everything, and, let them figure out, what they want to figure out.
Well, that actually kind of leads perfectly to my next question, and just quickly, because I've got a couple more before we open it up to a wider conversation. I wanted to dig a little bit more about your experience working with museums, and maybe you could say a bit about what representation in museums means to you, why you don't sign your work, how you want to be identified on a label, and what opportunities museums can offer. I know you've been particularly countering lack of representation through your work in the Breach Project. So maybe you could say a little about that before we move on.
Yeah, I referenced a few points. I'll try to bring them all in. I took museum studies and I did an internship at the Smithsonian when I was 18. And when I went into the collection as an internship with a Smithsonian badge, you can get into different collections and continue research. And I took that opportunity that summer to check out what do they have on Shinnecock. And they didn't really have much. And if they had anything, it was written by a non-Shinnecock person. And so what does it mean to have somebody else write about who you are? And I remember that. And I remember when I looked up, because my internship was at the National Museum of the American Indian. And that was a relatively new museum when I was working with the collection move from where it was located in New York in the Bronx to Suitland, Maryland. When I looked at other nations represented in that collection, it was extensive to some degree. But when I looked up my community, it was like we were hardly there. So what does that mean when... And it also reminded me when I looked up as a student, I was asked to go write a book about, my culture, where I'm from. And when I would go into the library, because you had to cite your resources, the books were written in a very violent way that in one historical event, there was a cargo ship called the Circassian that was offshore during December, and our people were asked to unload the cargo for the wealthy captain before a big nor'easter came through. And they were held by gunpoint at one point when it wasn't safe enough because the storm was too high to go out to continue to unload the cargo by that captain. But he forced them to keep going. So he went, so our men kept going on the Circassian to bring the cargo back until they couldn't come back to shore. And they passed away in the storm on that ship. And the newspaper wrote as that those men dying meant that all the sperm for our nation died. And so when you're reading that as a young person in a library where you have to write about who you are, and the thing is saying you're all gone, that was really harmful. And then to be in a museum space that is supposed to be a national public collection representing our nation, and your existence is also written by non-Indigenous people. Those things, I think, pushed me later on in life to figure out, how do you get heard when your coast is eroding? How do you get heard when you can't economically feed your family or build up certain infrastructure for your community? What amplification and honoring is given for the smaller people in a greater conversation of this impact? So in all honesty, the serendipity part, I had no idea I was going to go into breach. I didn't know that when I made that palette of teeth that I wasn't done. I actually came home one day and there was a show that it was and a curator was like, "Oh, what would you like the title of your show to be?" And they always ask that. And I'm like, I said to my husband, who's an artist, we were at the table and I said, I don't think I'm done with breach. Can I call the next show breach again? And he was like, "You can do whatever you want. You're the artist." And this idea of like giving myself permission, I think it's something that I grew up was hard to do. But when I was in that moment and he said that, I was like, okay, well, I know I can do whatever, but I can't explain to somebody else calling the show the same thing over and over again. So let me dig a little bit deeper. Okay, I'll call them logbooks. This will be a logbook, and then I can tell the other person this will still be breach, but let's put logbook and then the year. And then that's how I can start to distinguish the years for you and your confusion that I'm not done with breach. And I want to call everything breach because it's all breach. So that was, that was a correlation to just the space of countering the collections, countering the visibility, but then thinking, later on when I started to go with breach and it was working and I could be the artist that I was, and I thought about, how do I bring this into that visibility in these spaces? And I got to be honest, and early on, what I was doing was not, it's still kind of, I'm not sure if it's popular, but I've gotten heard a bit with breach. I donated a lot of my early work to collections. With the intention that when that work would be accepted into a collection, that I wanted them to list Shinnecock as a prominent aspect on the labels and the accessioning and all of that, with the context of why I made that early series of abundance. We're dealing with coastal erosion, so it was a way for me to say, here is my gift, do you accept it? And then by it being in these collections, now when a younger person from my nation goes to these museums, they can see Shinnecock is there. So that also goes back to your question about signature. The breach work is something that I'm always learning, but I'm learning because I'm meeting people and they become a part of breach. But I can't, it's almost like how you go to church and it's like a long sermon, or people want to talk about the whole Bible or something. So I sometimes want to honor like Manos Nathan. He was the elder that invited me to Aotearoa. Alan Sillaboy was the Mi'kmaq artist that brought us together for the exchange that we did in Mi'kmaq territory with the path we share and the whales. My friends, Stevie and Hera, I met in Aotearoa. They all become a part of this relationship. So I didn't feel like I could sign a collective narrative of breach. So I just call everything breach, and they all get their accession numbers. And then people want to have Courtney M. Leonard attached to it. But I try to play around with that. If you look at any of my social media stuff, I hardly like to take photos of myself, which is kind of like a counter to some artists who are very much, here's my image as an artist next to my work. I'm just trying my best to navigate, and not everything I do, I think sometimes is a good, like now that I'm older and this has been working, I wonder what next, what should I be doing next? Or is this enough? And I'm also very blessed to say that now there are other contemporary, and not that there weren't, we have elders from my community that are artists as well. David Martin, Denise, so there's a lot of different artists who are older than me, who I should not act as if I just showed up and I'm the only artist from my nation. But there are younger people now, and the younger people are contemporary photographers like Jeremy Dennis, and there are painters from my community, and so those people are getting their work into collections now, and so that ripple effect of presence and resonance and acknowledgement, I feel like it's working great. So now what am I supposed to do? So I'm trying to think more into like applied sciences and ways that I can continue to grow community through different projects potentially. So in my mind, that's the energy I'm thinking about. But I'm still learning. But those are some things of what led me to like labels, activating white box spaces with countering and collection, the intentionality behind donation. But I'm grateful now that acquisitions come with finances, because I'll tell you, I'm 42 years old, and this is a complete blessing, because I know not many people are able to have this opportunity. But my husband and I, as artists, just bought our first home this year ever. And it was a very huge learning process and a huge blessing that when I talked to my grandfather of color, that he also generationally shared his story about his first home. So I would have had a first home a long time ago, potentially, if that was my initial investment with this work.
Yeah. I think you have such a beautiful and generous approach, Courtney, and I hope you might take a few questions from our audience here, if we can open that up.
I can talk, and I'm so happy to be with you guys. So you feel free to ask questions, and I'm here for you. Yeah.
Do we have any already in the chat?
No questions in the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask Courtney something, please feel free.
I have a lot of other questions too, so I could go on.
I have one. It's just about what you said a while ago about the levee, and how about the moon.
Yeah.
And so, I thought you could explain that a little more.
Yeah. So when there is a super moon or a full moon, tide gets high. So our tide cycle it goes by the moon. When the towns sometimes set up their infrastructure, dams, levees that open up floodgates for the water to come in or release, it's sometimes not set up to when those particular fall years had these super moons. And my daughter, her name is Niipawotohoman, and it means wild strawberry moon. And I think it was interesting because she would never go to sleep when she was a baby. And my sister was like, well, you shouldn't have named her Moon. When she was born, I started to pay attention to a lot of like the eclipses that we've had and the so the series of super moons really brought in that high tide, and the levee wasn't structured for those new kind of moon seasons. And when the high tide came in, a lot of Bunker or Mehedan were kind of herded into that space during high tide. And when the moon cycle changed and the water reduced, there was an abundance of fish locked in those gates that weren't able to release out. And so they lost oxygen. So the lack of oxygen, the majority of that mass of fish coming in, it was the timing of a lot of things: warming water, a moon, the levees. And so that led to those fish all dying. I hope I'm explaining it a little bit more. But that's what it was. I was thinking, wow, if they just listen or watched, they should have gone out there and opened the gates. So, and what happened was that happened in the Peconic Bay Inlet Canoe Place area. And when that occurred, that is outside of our nation's, like, it's our traditional territory, but it's not where our nation is. So it's a town close to there. So it's a town system. But when all those fish died, they have to go somewhere when the tide and the current moves. So they got pushed out and they moved further down, and they came close to our, like right on our shores, and they were just rotting. So it's kind of that idea of upriver, downriver responsibility. If somebody's not treating the water well upriver and you're a downriver community, then can you hold that upriver community responsible for their actions that led to the repercussions that you're living with? So those are kind of the dynamics that we deal with sometimes. Like, we didn't create these problems, but we're forced to kind of like live with them, but we're forced to live with them with not the same wealth and access as the communities around us that could take those fish in dumpsters and put them someplace else, where we had to kind of sit with them rotting.
Thank you.
I just want to say a huge thank you to Courtney and Rosie for their time this evening. Courtney, hearing about your practice is just kind of mind-blowing. The way that you think about all of these different connections is just so meticulous and thoughtful, and I really appreciated hearing from you tonight. So thank you both so much, and we look forward to seeing the rest of you on Thursday for our final workshop. Good night, everybody.
Thank you for being educators and being here and everything. Really appreciate it. All right.
And thank you, Courtney. It's always illuminating.